He wrote 60 of the hardest piano pieces ever written in a single opus number, and now he's infamous for that. But why did he write them, and is it fair that that's what's defined his reputation? I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Amédée Méreaux. Jean-Amédée Lefroy de Méreaux was born in Paris in September 1802. He came from a family of musicians. His father and grandfather were both composers. His grandfather had taught at the National Institute of Music, which later became the Paris Conservatoire, and his father had been an organist of some renown. While he received a balanced education, Amédée followed in his family footsteps, studying the piano briefly with Muzio Clementi, but mostly with Anton Reicha, a friend of Beethoven's, who had interesting ideas but is largely remembered for his contributions to the wind quintet genre. Méreaux came of age in a 19th century which would slowly become more entranced with the piano. It was a middle and upper class status symbol, plenty of people learned it, and technological innovations led to sturdier instruments, which in turn led to the rise of flashy ultra-virtuosi like Franz Liszt or Charles Valentin Alkan. Méreaux built himself up among the well-known performers of the day. He became an honorary professor of music through the connections of a boyhood friend, and his mother was well connected aristocratically, which allowed him to not just perform for the upper class, but also to teach their sons and daughters. A pretty solid gig if you could get it. When the July Revolution of 1830 swept through France, Méreaux hightailed it out of there, touring first through Belgium and then finally in England, where he accompanied, among others, the acclaimed opera singers Maria Malibran and Laure Cinti Damereau, and performed on at least one occasion with Frédéric Chopin. The stress of traveling, far from an easy task in those days, led many to settle down and give up performing careers in favor of becoming locally renowned piano teachers, and Méreaux was no exception. When he was in his early 30s, he put his traveling ways behind him and settled down in Rouen, in the north of France. He knew all the day's now mostly forgotten composer-pianists and was considered a jack of all trades. He was hired at the Rouen Conservatoire, and he became their go-to musicologist. He continued performing and focused on the music of the past. In 1844, he presented a concert of works by the Baroque composer Jean-Philippe Rameau. He also continued to compose, write journal articles, and teach both piano and composition. As a musicologist, his greatest achievement was his 3-volume edition of harpsichord music of composers from 1637 to 1790, published between 1864 and 1867. He intended his volumes to be a corrective measure against the modifications that other pianists gave harpsichord music in attempts to popularize it. To do this, Méreaux wrote out all the ornamentations that characterize Baroque keyboard music, thinking that providing a table or chart of these ornamentations would scare potential performers away. Of course, in comparison to modern editions of harpsichord music, Méreaux too falls into ahistorical traps, adding slurs and dynamic markings where there were none in the original. But we have to keep in mind that this was a century before the revival of historically informed performance practice, which would have led to more historically informed performances based on historically accurate scores. In the context of the time, Méreaux really believed in this music, and his tweaks were so more pianists would learn them. So integral was Méreaux to the musical life of Rouen that he was elected to their Academy of Sciences, Letters, and Arts in 1858, and was elected its president in 1865, an unusual honor for a musician. He passed away of a heart condition in April 1874 at the age of 71. Rouen mourned his passing with a huge funeral, and to this day there is still a street in that city named after him. Although he wrote other music, including a string quartet, 2 masses, and several concerti, Méreaux's music is primarily for the piano, and no piece is more known by him than his 60 Etudes, Opus 63. These have overshadowed everything else he ever wrote because they are some of the hardest pieces ever written for this instrument. And when I say hard, I mean hard. You can find endless debates as to what exactly is the toughest piano piece ever written, and there are about 500,000 different contenders, many of which emerge out of this 19th century virtuoso tradition. But Méreaux's music is uniquely difficult in that it stretches the limits of the human capability to even perform them. These etudes are laser-focused on agility and dare their performers to keep up with their rollicking demands. Occasionally, a Méreaux piece would crop up in a treatise aimed at developing skilled players into virtuosi, and so you'll see his name and a couple of his pieces crop up in compilations which include other now forgotten names like Rosenhain, Thalberg, and Döhler. His toughest music stayed obscure for many years, but has gained significant attention with the advent of scrolling score videos right here on YouTube, helped in part due to their difficulty and the relative lack of recordings. MIDI has been very kind to Méreaux. While Liszt and Chopin have endured, and Alcan to a somewhat lesser degree, Méreaux's work was not disseminated by the pianists who have come since his time. Even pianists who have otherwise championed obscure and technically demanding repertoire, like Marc-Andre Hamelin, have shunned Méreaux's music. In Hamelin's case, he said that he didn't find the difficulty to be worth the trouble. For Hamelin, Opus 63 is a collection written in a worthless idiom. Of special note is number 24 of this collection, marked Bravura, which features a hand-crossing configuration that approaches self-parody. At one point, the left hand is tasked with jumping from the bottom to the top of the keyboard and back again. There's a much better way to play this than how it's notated. Méreaux knew better if he were trying to write something that was idiomatic, so why would he do this? Simple. He wasn't actually trying to be idiomatic. To get more context, I think we need to look at what the etude is versus what the concert etude is. For many years, the etude was just a technical genre. It was a technique exercise. It wasn't intended to be heard in concert. But with the rise of Chopin and Liszt and all these other figures from the middle of the 19th century, we start to see the concert etude develop. And the concert etude would be things like Chopin's etudes, things that are difficult and work out a very specific technique at the keyboard, but are also pieces where if you were an audience member, you would go to the concert hall and pay money to hear and see someone perform them, because they're interesting as pieces, as well as being good technical exercises. Méreaux's etudes are better understood in the older sense of the term, that is, as a study. If you can pull off a Méreaux etude with a fraction of the accuracy he requires, you'll have no problem with smaller scale versions of that same technique which would crop up in other pieces. You don't have to perform these hand crossings with the accuracy that he wants. The idea is that if you can pull something like this off in C major and be remotely accurate with it, then you'll be good to go with any hand crossing that would come up in any other piece. Méreaux takes pianistic techniques to such an extreme that it's hard to be musical with them, and so in a way, Hamelin is right. But I don't think that Méreaux was trying to be musical. Though infamous for his Opus 63 he may be, I don't think it's smart to judge his musical worth primarily on this collection. What bolsters this case is that Méreaux's playing and his compositions are not in keeping with Liszt's musical philosophy. Liszt and Wagner constituted a new German school which promulgated a music of the future, which had daring harmonic progressions, did away with traditional forms, and in general tried to reshape tonality in their image. Not only do you see a more conservative classicism in Méreaux's harmonic language, but this extended to his playing as well. Contemporaries said that his playing had more to do with the old German school versus something Lisztian or even French. Because his etudes have dominated his postmodern reputation, the question of Méreaux's musical merit is largely down to whether or not you think that these pieces are worth the effort to learn. For Cyprian Katsaris, the answer has been yes. He's recorded several Méreaux etudes, as have daring amateur performers, dedicated to exploring the hidden depths of the 19th century virtuoso repertoire. If you're a fan of the obscure and like to see pianists sweat it out in pursuit of some of the most difficult works ever notated, then Méreaux's etudes may have a place in your heart. But I'd like to take this last moment to make the case that we shouldn't remember Méreaux for his etudes. Their frightening difficulty makes it easy for him to stand out in the footnotes of history, but if he hadn't published his Opus 63, he likely would have just been a small name alongside your Hummels and your Kalkbrenners, those for whom there has always been a small and devoted following, but don't have the same name recognition as, your Chopins and your Liszts. The following that his etudes have gotten is on the back of them being difficult pieces. It's telling that interest in the etudes hasn't spilled over into interest in the larger works, pieces where Méreaux was going for more musicality over sheer technical wizardry. Certainly his etudes are part of history, both of their genre and their composer, but to think of Méreaux purely as the composer of these pieces, whether you like them or not, is to typecast a musician whose talents and breadth of knowledge deserve far better.